Hello everybody, thanks for coming over this afternoon. No, it's been a long day and not many sessions to go, so it's nice to see you here this afternoon and take your time out. Today I'm going to talk about our journey for moving an application that we built for a customer that we now own the intellectual property for, and how we moved that from being an on-premise complex Java application into AWS and into the cloud, and how we turned that bit of intellectual property into something that we could use and for registry management solutions. What we've noticed in our business, where we talk to government customers and commercial customers, there's a few key drivers that are really driving the adoption of cloud. Key ones for us are around the consumer and end user demand to get digital services online, and they're really demanding that experience that is similar to what they're getting through other services. So whether it's Facebook or through online banking tools, they expect that in the digital service delivery from government organisations and public sector organisations. They also expect to see continual improvement. So if there's something that they need fixed or see some changes or what's happening in everyday life, they expect to see that reflected in the applications they're using and the forms they're driving with. From an organisational point of view, if you're managing a system like this, you need to find cost savings for that system. You need to deliver services efficiently, and you also only want to pay for what's used. So we all know why you want to move to the cloud. And one of the other key things, though, is it's really about meeting that consumer expectation, being able to be agile, be able to deliver a service quickly, while maintaining a core system that's really important to you and to your customers. We own some intellectual property, which I'm going to talk about, and our journey to move that to the cloud. And so today I'm going to talk about that journey and how we've done it. We started in 2014 with a system called LifeLink, which we implemented for New South Wales Department of Justice. LifeLink's all about the births of marriages registration in New South Wales, and manages some of the oldest records in New South Wales. So system life events all the way back to when Australia was first settled. And we migrated all those records into the births of marriages registry for New South Wales. And we now deal with hundreds of thousands of events every year. So every time somebody wants to notify somebody getting married, there's a birth happens or somebody dies in New South Wales, that record goes into the births of marriages registry. It's an on-premise Java application. It's fairly complex, but we worked with the department to get that intellectual property so we could take it to other states and other jurisdictions, and also look at how we can manage registries for people. So not just births of marriages and life events, but how we could manage other systems like licenses and different registry items. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. There's an article yesterday about New South Wales now having doubled the number of Aboriginal birth registrations happening since they've moved online, and that's happened in the last few months. But that's the system here that we built that has enabled that to happen, and it's really important to get this data into the system. So we looked at it and said, okay, it should be really easy to get this into the cloud. It should be, we want to re-architect and take advantage of the cloud. How do we do that? That should be really easy. So, because we're a software development company, we've been doing this for a long time, we know how to do this. So when we looked at the technology and the technical and the architectural challenges, we threw a few more in there to make it a little bit harder for ourselves. We added moving to infrastructure as a code just so we could deploy everything. We wanted to make it multi-tenanted, so we had a platform that we could bring other businesses, other government agencies onto. We wanted to replace the core database and introduce document databases in there as well. We wanted to redo the front end because we had a big complex Java server-side front end, and we wanted to replace it with an Angular and API-driven front end. We wanted to deploy it for a customer that really hadn't adopted AWS into their environments, and so didn't have network configuration set up, didn't have direct connect set up, and they wanted to roll it out. We also had to migrate a really large data set. So we're doing this for Victoria at the moment, so Victoria's births and marriages registry, and it's got a large complex data set that's almost as big as New South Wales. And finally, we decided that we need a point of sale system in place as well that integrated via AWS to all the counter staff throughout the registry in Victoria. From a business point of view, the things you need to consider if you're looking at migrating something into AWS, and especially if you're operating a government system, you've got to think about, well, how do I protect that large, important data set that might contain some very highly sensitive data? So if you can imagine versus marriages data is quite sensitive data and has to be protected. If you want to provide services so you can continue, while you're continually improving, if you want to add new features, if you want to introduce legislation changes and adopt to them, how do you do that without stopping the service for your customers? With a births and marriages registry, there's a lot of products. So you can buy birth certificates, you can buy commemorative birth certificates. So if you're managing some sort of other controlled data set and you have products and services around that, how do you introduce those new products in the system and configure it to be able to deal with those? And it might be changing prices on those sort of things. How do you manage that yourself as an organisation? You do have to continually deal with the complexity of legislation. So how things are always changing. There's always change going in the legislation and the law. How do you deal with that in the system, and how do you be nimble enough and agile enough to deal with that while maintaining that original data set and protecting it? And if you're running a highly visible service, if something goes wrong with it, it can be it impacts your reputation as an organisation to deliver that service to somebody. You need to think about that, and how do you prevent those sort of outages? And we, with the births and marriages system, we integrate to hospitals and funeral directors and marriage celebrants. They need to be able to operate. They don't want outages in their system when they want to lodge the data. So you've got to make sure the system is designed in a way to handle all that. And you've got to deal with that when you're migrating across to the cloud. And you've got to then you've got to architect the system to deal with those sort of changes when you're in the cloud. I just want to stop and talk a little bit about what a registry is. We see a register as an official list or record, and most of you, I think, will know what that is. So it has very specific rules around how the data gets into the system, what the data, it has to go through approval processes and acceptance processes, and you don't want to ever lose the information. You can't, as an organisation who protects this data, it's got to stay rock solid. And while consumers want fast moving and fast changing user experiences, you've still got to protect your core data system. So it's not about, our system's not about just building a front end on the service, on the data service, but it's the end-to-end management of that system. In a registry, the data has multiple parts and complex relationships. So they might be interrelated between, and not well known necessarily. So if somebody manages a motor vehicle registry, right? So who is the owner, who's the seller, those sort of bits of data are loosely coupled, but you need to be able to maintain those relationships. The items in the registry often have state, and they might have authorisation at different parts of that state. So we built a system for cabinet papers management in New South Wales, and that's all about cabinet submissions. So it's built on top of this registry management platform, and during the cabinet submission process, different people can see different documents at different points in time in that process and the approval process. So how do you manage that fine-grained control over who can see the data in the system, who can access that, who can they share it with, how do you know who's viewed it and who's accessed it? From an individual's perspective, you tend to be interacting with registries all the time when you're interacting with government. So it might be you want to request a service, you've got a pet, you want a license, you've got you apply for a grant, you become trained as a nurse or a teacher and you want to register that in the system. Those sort of things are all dealing with registries. Often they have a renewal process. There might be some reviewing your credentials. You've got to prove who you are. All this sort of stuff means you're probably interacting with a registry or managing a registry. And it might be that you pay for that service. So you might pay for a pet license or a gun license or a fishing license. Those sort of things tend to be registry type interactions. If you're managing these things, if you're assessing and you're reviewing and approving an application, then you're probably dealing with some sort of registered item. It might be that you're tracking livestock movements between farms, and that's a registry. So those sort of things are, as an agency, if you've got all these sort of data sets that you're managing as a government agency that you need to treat as a registry and protect that data and understand it very well. We do things like matching the records, and we have systems in place to do that. We're very rules-driven, so we can enforce a lot of the legislation via rules, and we can have clear visibility on who's accessing data and seeing it along the way. If you look at a simple or a standard sort of workflow, it might be quite simple. You might see somebody submits a form online, they go through an approval process, it gets rejected, or it gets approved and it gets into the system and might get renewed later. Now this is not it doesn't seem to be very complex, but how do you make that form accessible online or digitally via mobile phones or via IVR systems, those sort of things? You want to have people interacting with them. How do you prove their identity? If they go on and submit this form, how do they prove who they are? You need to interact with document verification systems to prove that state of identity. If you're then approving the thing, how do you've got that proof of identity that's been recorded during the system, how do you then make sure that that proof is valid and you've got that evidence? How do you deal with legislation changes? How do you deal with data that's coming in from multiple sources? So the birth is a great scenario where a hospital registers a birth of a child and they put the data in about the parents and the child and the name, but the parents also have to go online and put that data in within a certain amount of time since the baby's been born. But which data is the authoritative data? Is it the parent's name and the time of birth, or is it the hospital's time of birth? Is it the weight? All those sort of data that's been collected, which one's the authoritative one, and how do you make those decisions? So our system has the framework in place to do all that matching and get it sorted out before, so it's all automated. And so we're finding now in New South Wales, a lot of those birth matches are happening automatically as part of the process. So I think about 60% of the records going into the system are now automatically matched and we don't have to intervene. The other thing though is, what happens if something comes up where you have a white list of names, for example, you don't want people, or a black list of names, and so certain names you don't want to approve, right? Because you want to keep it might be city names or brand names, those sort of things, but there's a special case comes in. How do you override those decisions? How do you get management involved who are in the approval process to come and override that decision, the decisions being made? So our system has that decision making built into it. So we've got a registry. We're using it for births and marriages in New South Wales. We've got another customer we're bringing on board. We want to move it to the cloud. Our plan was and is to replace the document database and move that so we've got a better data search and we can have better search on it. So we've introduced Solar for better searching and better finding of data. We've introduced a better rules engine. We've introduced better matching engines. We replaced and re-architected the system so it's the UIs are much easier to replace so it's an Angular UI so we can build and quickly deploy new user interfaces. We've got RESTful APIs in front, behind all those APIs now so we can quickly innovate on top of the data set underneath. We've separated out the way we interact with the different audiences. So from a public point of view, they want a simplified experience. They don't remember how they registered 10 years ago when they did a last event. So why would you force them to remember a username and password? How do you deal with those sort of things when people are coming on to the system to re-interact? Stakeholders like organisations like councils with interacting with title systems or hospitals interacting with births and marriages systems, they need a different experience. They put different data in it and they have different rigor around it. And they often have to fill in quite a lot of data. How do they save it? How do they come back to the application and or review it internally before it gets submitted? And then the staff have to deal with the approval process. How do you automate those approval processes? So our plan was to bring this into AWS and allow that service to be delivered and managed that way. And so we wanted to automate as much as possible. So not only automate from our staff using the system, but automate the way we deliver that service. So we automate the infrastructure delivery, automate the deployment, automate the testing of the system. From a team structure point of view, we had quite a large development team working across adding new features to the registry for Victoria while we're building it, but we were doing this work around bringing it onto the cloud. Collaboration with your customer is really important, and collaboration between teams is really important, so we need to make sure we have the right tools in place. We had a dedicated DevOps team who really worked hard at making sure everything was automated and deployable and worked really well. We worked closely with our clients to make sure that we were interacting with them really well. We use CloudFormation to provision the infrastructure. We use Jenkins and Ansible to provision and deploy as part of our CI/CD process. We moved to Bitbucket in the cloud because it was a better way for us to interact with the source rather than having it on-premise, which is what we've always previously done. Slack was great for communication between the team members, and we had teams across states, so it was invaluable for us to be able to communicate between those teams. And we used Jira for story and task management. It was just a really easy way for us to have some visibility of how we were progressing and what work was needed to be done. And one of the other things we did for us, which was a great benefit, was managing our own test and dev environments in AWS so we could spin them up and provision them as needed, because we learned a lot more about managing those environments before we then moved to the customer site. From learnings then from when we first moved into the customer side, so the customer had their own managed environment and a managed service provider on that environment, we had to deal with the customer really wanting to have that 24/7 support and have a managed service provider provide that. We work very closely with that managed service provider to understand how they wanted to configure the environment, how they parameterized variables and configuration, and we work closely with them to make sure that happened. We wanted to test the deployments very early because testing, and while it's a complex Java app, there's a lot of components to that app, and we needed to make sure they all work together. So we use great diagnostics, so we use Dynatrace for measuring the performance in the system, but we also used it to detect the end-to-end flow of data through the system. And one of the, so for example, one of the things we found was that there was, when we did the direct connect from the client side into AWS, the new network switches failed. And both of them failed, and we didn't expect either of them to fail. So there was some, and then they replaced them, and we found some other networking issues. In traditional IT projects, identifying network issues is very difficult, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on, but we resolved this very quickly, and we had some great diagnostics in place. The other thing we could do is test our data migration early. So our data migration team has been doing a lot of work on moving all the data across, 100% of the data across into AWS, into the cloud. There's quite a lot of data. We had to use Snowball to move all the images across, but we had to then keep testing that we had the data and it was all correct. And interestingly, in a Burst marriages registry system, you can't fix data errors. So if somebody put an address in and wrote it in the system in the 1800s and it was written a certain way, you can't change it because that's wrong. It's got to go into the system as is. So your verification systems and tools become quite different, and the way you manage that as you move stuff across becomes different. One of the nice things about using AWS to do data migration is that we could scale up the servers doing the ETLs. So as we loaded data into the system, we'd spend a weekend processing the data. We could put bigger instances on and handle that while we're doing the testing to reduce the time it took to do the migrations and test the results, but we could do that and do it quite readily. So we've now migrated to AWS. The system's about to go live in Victoria. We've extracted a registry management solution out of that so we can actually build registries for a whole range of organisations, and we're keen to do that for you. It's available on AWS and we're ready to deploy it. At the end of this year, the Connected Bursts and Marriages product, which is our Bursts and Marriages solution, will manage life events of 14 million citizens. And about 123 million records and 6,500 users and stakeholders. So it's a reasonably large system in terms of systems. It's an enterprise registry, as I said, it's now available on AWS. So if you've got a service you want to digitise, come and talk to us. We're over, we've got a booth over there, so happy to have a chat. From an AWS point of view, we've now got a scalable solution that works really well. It's got the fine-grained access control so we can protect the data really well. It's got a really resilient architecture so you can deal with those things like reducing outages and deploy new features really quickly. Our next steps for us is about leveraging more of the AWS services and moving more from traditional architectural patterns to using the cloud a lot more and getting better results out of the AWS services and really moving from on the cloud to in the cloud and getting the full benefit of the AWS services. So some of the things you should be thinking about. How do you securely manage your data? How do you supply data to others? Do you have external people accessing the data, and how do you protect that data and make sure it gets into the right hands? How do you provide an ongoing great customer experience that meets community expectations? How do you do that with your services you're providing? How will you securely move your existing applications, your legacy applications across to the cloud? We often hear about SAP workloads or VMware workloads, but what if you've custom built something? How do you move that across to the cloud? Have you thought it through properly? And how will you take advantage of everything that AWS has to offer? It's not just about low price, it's about ongoing services and what other services you can get benefit from as you move forward and really use your investment in AWS. So thank you for today for listening. There's some brochures on the seats. We do have a booth here. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more about either our registry management solution or how we can help you move your application into the cloud and what we can do for you.